On a November morning in 1979, in the auction barn at Grady County, Oklahoma, a man named Arthur Tidwell learned something about himself that would change his life forever. He learned what it felt like to be laughed at by an entire room. Arthur was 34 years old. He had driven 18 miles from his farm, 80 acres of mediocre land that he was trying to coax into something better. He had come to bid on a tractor, not a fancy tractor, not a new tractor, an old Farm All-H that had been sitting in a dead man's barn for 3 years, rust starting on the fenders, engine that probably needed rebuilding, but it was a tractor, and Arthur needed one. His own tractor, a 1952 Ford 8N that had belonged to his father, had finally given up 2 weeks ago. The engine block had cracked, unfixable, and without a tractor, Arthur couldn't farm. Without farming, he couldn't eat. Without eating, well, he had saved $340 over the past year. Every penny he could scrape together from selling eggs, from odd jobs, from going without. He figured the old farm-all might go for $300, maybe $350 if bidding got competitive. It was a risk, but it was his only chance. What Arthur didn't have was shoes, his boots. The same boots he'd worn for 7 years, resoled twice, patched more times than he could count, had finally disintegrated 3 days ago. The sole had separated completely from the upper. He had tried to fix them with wire and glue. It hadn't worked. He didn't have money for new boots. He had $340, and every dollar of that was earmarked for the tractor. So Arthur Tidwell drove to the Grady County auction barn in November, walked across the frozen parking lot, and stepped inside on bare feet. Now let me stop here and tell you something about Arthur Tidwell, because this story only makes sense if you understand where he came from. Arthur was born in 1945, in a one-room shack on land his grandfather had homesteaded in 19... His father, William Tidwell, had farmed that land his whole life, never more than 100 acres, never with any equipment newer than 20 years old, never with any money in the bank. But William Tidwell had taught his son something that would prove more valuable than money. Never borrow, William would say, sitting on the porch in the evenings, looking out at the land that barely kept them alive. The minute you borrow, you belong to someone else. Your farm belongs to someone else. Your future belongs to someone else. Stay poor if you have to. Stay small if you have to. But stay free. Arthur had listened. He had taken those words into his bones. When he inherited the farm in 1968, his father dead of a heart attack at 59, worn out by decades of hard labor, Arthur was 23 years old. He had nothing but 80 acres of marginal land, a broken-down house, and a father's advice echoing in his head. Never borrow. For 11 years, Arthur had lived by that rule. He had watched his neighbors expand, buy new equipment, take on debt that made him dizzy just hearing about it. He had stayed small, stayed poor, stayed free, and now he was standing in an auction barn with no shoes, trying to buy a rusted tractor so he could keep farming another year. Let me tell you about Warren Caldwell, because every story needs a villain, and Warren was born for the role. Warren Caldwell was the biggest farmer in Grady County. Not by inheritance, but by acquisition. His father had left him 400 acres By 1979, Warren had turned that into 3,200 acres, bought piece by piece from neighbors who couldn't compete, who fell behind on payments, who gave up and sold out. Warren didn't farm that land himself. Not anymore. He had men for that. Hired hands, tenants, sharecroppers. Warren's job was acquisition, expansion, growth, and debt. Warren Caldwell owed more money than most people in Grady County would see in their lifetimes. He owed the Federal Land Bank, the Production Credit Association, the equipment dealers, the seed companies. He owed so much that his monthly interest payments exceeded what Arthur Tidwell made in a year. But in 1979, that didn't seem to matter. Land values were rising. Crop prices were strong. Interest rates were manageable. Warren's empire looked invincible, and Warren liked to make sure everyone knew it. He drove a new truck every year. He wore custom-made cowboy boots with silver tips. He sat in the front row at every auction, buying equipment he didn't need just to prove he could. He was loud, and he was cruel, and he had never in his life known what it was like to be poor. On that November morning, Warren Caldwell spotted Arthur Tidwell the moment he walked in. Specifically, he spotted Arthur Tidwell's feet. The auction barn went quiet in waves. First the people near the door, then the rows behind them, then finally the whole room. Everyone staring at the thin man in patched overalls, standing on the cold concrete floor in his bare feet. Arthur kept his eyes forward. He walked toward the back row, the cheap seats, the seats for people who were only there to look, not to buy. He figured he'd sit there, wait for the farmall to come up, make his bid, and leave. Maybe no one would notice, but Warren Caldwell noticed. Well, well, well. Warren's voice was loud, meant to carry. He stood up from his seat in the front row and turned to face the crowd. Looks like we've got a hobo at the equipment auction. You lost, friend? Soup kitchen's down the road. Some people laughed. Not everyone, but enough. Arthur stopped walking. He could feel the cold concrete under his feet, could feel every eye in the room on him. His face was burning, but he kept his voice steady. I'm here for the farmall H, lot 47. I've got money to bid. Money to bid? Warren laughed louder now, playing to the crowd. Son, you can't afford shoes. What are you gonna do? Pay in chickens? More laughter, louder now. People were enjoying this. I've got cash, Arthur said. $340. $340. Warren said the number slowly, like it was the funniest joke he'd ever heard. That's real cute. Tell you what, friend. He started walking down the aisle toward Arthur, his polished boots clicking on the concrete. Why don't you take your $340, go buy yourself some shoes, and leave the farming to people who know what they're doing? He was standing right in front of Arthur now, close enough that Arthur could smell his cologne, could see the gold tooth in his smile, could count the silver threads in his custom-made jacket. Because a man who can't afford shoes, Warren said, loud enough for everyone to hear, has no business owning a tractor. The laughter this time was different. It was the laughter of people who were relieved it wasn't them. The laughter of people who wanted to be on Warren's side, because being on Warren's side was safer than the alternative. Arthur looked at Warren Caldwell for a long moment. He looked at the expensive boots, the heavy gold watch, the soft hands that had never known real work. Then he looked down at his own feet, bare, calloused, cracked from cold. The feet of a man who had nothing except his land and his pride. And something inside Arthur Tidwell went quiet. Not defeated, quiet. The way a man gets quiet when he's made a decision that will change everything. You're right, Arthur said softly. I can't afford shoes. He turned and walked out of the auction barn, back across the frozen parking lot, back to his truck, back home. He didn't buy the tractor. He didn't buy anything. But he didn't forget. Now let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been humiliated like that? Publicly, in front of people you have to see every day? Most people, when that happens, they do one of two things. They crumble, let the shame eat them alive, give up, accept that they're exactly what the Warren Caldwells of the world say they are. Or they burn. Let the anger consume them, make reckless decisions, destroy themselves trying to prove something. Arthur Tidwell did neither. He went home. He sat on his porch, bare feet on the cold boards, and he thought about his father. Stay poor if you have to, William had said. Stay small if you have to, but stay free. Arthur was free. Warren Caldwell, with his 3,200 acres and his silver-tipped boots, was owned by every bank and credit company in Oklahoma. Arthur had nothing, but nothing was his. And in that moment, on that cold November evening, Arthur made himself a promise. He would never borrow. He would never take shortcuts. He would keep doing things his father's way, slow, steady, sustainable. And someday, somehow, the men who laughed at him would understand why. He didn't know how. He didn't know when. He just knew that he would still be standing when Warren Caldwell's empire fell. Because empires always fall. The ones built on debt fall hardest of all. Now let me tell you about the next 6 years, because that's where the real story happens. The first thing Arthur did was solve the tractor problem. He spent the winter rebuilding his father's old Ford 8N, not the engine block, which was beyond saving, but everything else. Then in February, he heard about a man 2 counties over who had a cracked engine block from a different 8N sitting in his barn, good for nothing but scrap. Arthur drove over, barefoot because he still didn't have shoes, and offered the man $40 for the ruined engine. The man laughed, not meanly, just surprised, and accepted. Arthur hauled that engine home and spent 2 months machining, welding, adapting. He made pieces fit that weren't meant to fit. He taught himself skills he'd never had. By April, the Ford was running again. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't powerful. But it worked. And Arthur had spent $40 instead of $300. The shoes came next. In May, Arthur drove to Oklahoma City, a trip he made once a year for supplies he couldn't get locally, and bought a pair of Red Wing work boots on sale. They cost $47. They were the best boots he'd ever owned. He would still be wearing them 6 years later, when everything changed. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Through 1980 and 1981, Arthur kept farming his 80 acres the same way he always had. Small scale, diverse crops, a few cattle, a few hogs, some chickens. He sold at local markets, avoided the commodity exchanges, kept his costs low and his debts non-existent. His neighbors thought he was crazy. The early 80s were boom times, grain prices high, land values rising, everyone expanding. The smart farmers were leveraging their equity, buying more land, scaling up to compete. Arthur stayed small. Tidwell's got no ambition, people said at the feed store. Still farming like his daddy did, still wearing the same boots, never gonna amount to anything. Warren Caldwell heard these conversations. He laughed along, made his own jokes about the barefoot farmer. Sometimes, when he drove past Arthur's property, he would slow down and honk, just to remind Arthur that he was watching, just to remind him who was king. Arthur never responded. He just kept working, and he kept saving. Every dollar that didn't go to survival went into a coffee can, buried behind his barn. The can filled slowly, $50 here, $100 there. By the end of 1981, Arthur had saved $2,400, more money than he'd ever had in his life, buried in the dirt like a secret. He wasn't sure what he was saving for. He just knew he needed to be ready. Then came 1982, and everything started to change. Let me tell you about the farm crisis, because without understanding it, you can't understand what happened to Warren Caldwell, or what it meant for Arthur Tidwell. In 1979, when Warren laughed at Arthur's bare feet, the agricultural economy looked invincible. Land values were at record highs. Grain exports were booming, especially to the Soviet Union. Farmers were encouraged to expand, to borrow, to plant fence row to fence row. Then the world shifted. The Soviet grain embargo hit first, cutting off the export market that had driven the boom. Then interest rates started climbing. The Federal Reserve, fighting inflation, pushed the prime rate from 6% to 12% to 15% to eventually over 20%. Land values, which had seemed to rise forever, began to fall. Farmers who had borrowed against their land suddenly owed more than their farms were worth. Farmers who had taken on variable rate loans saw their payments double, then triple. Farmers who had expanded during the good times found themselves drowning in debt during the bad times. By 1983, the foreclosures had begun. By 1984, they were epidemic. Farms that had been in families for generations were being sold at auction, broken up, absorbed by banks and corporations. Grady County was hit hard. Farm after farm went under. Families who had seemed prosperous just a few years ago were lining up at commodity distribution centers, applying for food stamps, watching everything their parents and grandparents had built disappear. And Warren Caldwell? Warren Caldwell was in more trouble than anyone knew. His debt load had seemed manageable when interest rates were 6%. At 20%, it was catastrophic. His monthly payments exceeded his income. His land, which he had borrowed against so heavily, was now worth less than he owed. He tried everything. He refinanced, he sold equipment, he laid off workers, he begged the banks for more time. Nothing worked. In January of 1985, the Federal Land Bank filed foreclosure proceedings against Warren Caldwell. His 3,200 acres, the empire he had built by laughing at men like Arthur Tidwell, would be sold at auction to pay his debts. Arthur heard the news at the feed store. He didn't say anything. He just nodded, bought his chicken feed, and drove home. That night, he dug up the coffee can behind his barn. He counted the money inside, $12,760, more than he'd ever had in his life, saved dollar by dollar over 6 years. Then he went inside and made some phone calls. Now let me tell you about the auction, because this is where the story comes full circle. The sale of Warren Caldwell's property was scheduled for March 15, 1985, almost exactly 6 years after the day Arthur had walked into the auction barn barefoot. It was a cold morning, just like that other morning. The same auction barn, the same wooden bleachers, the same concrete floor. But this time, Arthur Tidwell was wearing boots. He arrived early, parked his truck at the back of the lot, and walked inside. He found a seat in the middle of the bleachers. Not the back row, not the front, just a regular seat with regular people. The auction barn filled slowly. Farmers came from all over the county, some to bid, most just to watch. There was something almost funereal about the atmosphere. Warren Caldwell had been the biggest man in Grady County for 2 decades. Watching his empire sold off piece by piece felt like watching a king die. Warren himself was there, sitting in the front row, the same seat he'd always sat in, the same place he'd stood when he pointed at Arthur's bare feet and laughed. But he wasn't laughing now. He looked smaller somehow. The expensive jacket was gone. He was wearing a plain wool coat, slightly worn. The gold watch was gone too, probably sold to pay bills. His face was gray, his eyes hollow. He looked like a man who had already lost everything and was just waiting for the paperwork to catch up. Arthur watched him from across the room. He didn't feel satisfaction exactly. He didn't feel joy. He felt something more complicated, something like recognition. Like looking at a man and seeing for the first time that he was just a man, not a king, not a giant, just a frightened person who had bet everything and lost. The auctioneer called the room to order. The sale began. First came the equipment. Tractors and combines and trucks, sold off one by one. Arthur watched the prices low, impossibly low. A John Deere 4440 that would have brought $40,000 5 years ago sold for $8,000. A combine worth $100,000 went for $35,000. The buyers were corporations, mostly, farming companies from out of state, picking over the carcass. Then came the land. The auctioneer announced it in parcels, 320 acres here, 480 acres there. The crown jewel was Warren's home place, 800 acres of the best bottomland in Grady County, including the farmhouse where Warren had been born, where his father had been born, where 3 generations of Caldwells had lived and worked and died. The opening bid was $400 per acre, a starting point. A joke, really. That land had been worth $2,000 an acre at the peak. "Do I hear 400? The auctioneer called. $400 per acre for 800 acres of prime bottomland? Silence. "Come on, folks. This is the finest farmland in the county. 400 to start?" More silence. The corporate buyers were waiting, letting the price drop. And then Arthur Tidwell raised his hand. 400, Arthur said. Every head in the room turned. Arthur felt the weight of their stares. The same people who had been there 6 years ago. The same people who had laughed. They were looking at him now, like they'd seen a ghost. Warren Caldwell turned around in his seat. His eyes found Arthur, and something flickered across his face. Confusion, then recognition, then something darker. "Do I hear 450? The auctioneer asked. One of the corporate buyers raised his paddle. 450. 500, Arthur said. Murmurs in the crowd. The corporate buyer hesitated, then $550, $600. The corporate buyer looked at his partner. Some quick calculations. Then $650. Arthur didn't hesitate. $700. The corporate buyers went into a huddle. $700 an acre for 800 acres was $560,000, more than they wanted to spend, more than the land was worth in the current market. They had other auctions to attend, other carcasses to pick over. "We're out," the corporate buyer said. The auctioneer looked around the room. $700 per acre. "Do I hear 750? 750 anywhere?" Silence. Going once at 700. Warren Caldwell was staring at Arthur. His face was a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. Going twice at 700. Arthur met Warren's eyes. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just looked at the man who had humiliated him 6 years ago. The man who was about to lose everything. And he waited. "Sold. To the gentleman in the middle row. 800 acres at $700 per acre. Sir, if you'll come to the table to settle the paperwork." Arthur stood up. He walked down the aisle toward the auctioneer's table, his Red Wing boots solid on the concrete floor. He had to walk past Warren Caldwell to get there. For a moment, neither man spoke. The whole room was watching, everyone holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen. Then Warren said, his voice cracked and rough, "You, the barefoot farmer." "That's right," Arthur said. "How?" "You didn't have. You couldn't have. I saved," Arthur said simply. "Every dollar for 6 years. No debt, no interest, no banks owning my future. Just work and patience and time. But $560,000. I don't have $560,000. Arthur reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I have $12,760 in cash, and a consortium of 15 small farmers who pooled their savings to buy your land. We're going to break it up into family-sized parcels and sell it back to the people you squeezed out over the years, at fair prices, with owner financing." Warren's face went from gray to white. "You planned this. For 6 years you planned this." "No, I just saved. I just waited. I just trusted that debt always comes due." Arthur paused. "You taught me that, Mr. Caldwell, that day in November when you laughed at my feet. You taught me that the man with no debt is the man who survives." He started to walk past Warren, toward the auctioneer's table. "Wait." Warren's voice was barely a whisper. "My house, the home place, my family has lived there for 3 generations." Arthur stopped. He turned back. "Are you asking me for something, Mr. Caldwell?" Warren's jaw tightened. The words seemed to cost him everything he had left. "I'm asking if I can buy it back. The house. Just the house and a few acres. Enough to live on. I have some money saved. Not much, but—"
"How much?"
"About $400. Arthur looked at Warren Caldwell, the man who had stood in this same auction barn, pointed at Arthur's bare feet, and told him he had no business owning a tractor. The man who had humiliated him in front of everyone. The man who had laughed. $400, Arthur repeated. "It's all I have. I know it's not enough. I know I don't deserve." "You're right," Arthur said. "You don't deserve anything." He watched Warren's face crumble, the last piece of hope dying. Then Arthur said, "But my father taught me something about how to treat people, even people who don't deserve it." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a pen. On the back of an envelope he wrote something, an address, a date, some numbers. "Be at my farm next Tuesday. We'll work out the paperwork. You can have the house and 10 acres around it, not as a purchase. I'll hold the deed. But you can live there as long as you want, rent-free. In exchange, I want one thing." "What?" "Tell your story. Every farmer you meet, every young person thinking about getting into agriculture, tell them what happened to you. Tell them about the debt, the expansion, the borrowed money that seemed so easy and turned out so hard. Tell them what my father told me. Stay poor if you have to, stay small if you have to, but stay free." Warren Caldwell stared at Arthur Tidwell for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. "I'll tell them." "Good. Arthur turned and walked to the auctioneer's table to sign the papers. Behind him, he heard Warren Caldwell sit down heavily, heard what might have been a sob, quickly stifled. He didn't look back. Let me tell you what happened after, because this story doesn't end with one auction. The consortium Arthur had organized, 15 small farmers who had pooled their savings, broke up Warren's empire exactly as planned. 800 acres became 8 separate farms, each one sold to a family who had been squeezed out during the boom years, each one financed through owner contracts at interest rates people could actually afford. The other parcels of Warren's land were handled similarly. By the end of 1985, what had once been one man's empire was now home to 23 families, all of them farming their own land, none of them owing a penny to any bank. Arthur kept some land for himself, 160 acres adjoining his original 80. For the first time in his life, he had room to expand. But he didn't expand much. He didn't buy new equipment. He didn't take on debt. He just kept farming the way his father had taught him, the way he'd always farmed. Slow, steady, sustainable. Warren Caldwell lived in his family's farmhouse until 1992, when he died of a heart attack at 69. In those 7 years, he did exactly what Arthur had asked. He traveled to schools, to farm bureaus, to county fairs, telling his story, warning young farmers about the seduction of debt, pointing to himself as an example of what happens when you build an empire on borrowed money. Some people listened, some didn't. But Warren told the story anyway, over and over, until the day he died. At his funeral, Arthur Tidwell was one of the pallbearers. Some people in Grady County thought that was strange, the barefoot farmer helping to bury the man who had humiliated him. But Arthur didn't see it that way. He made a mistake, Arthur said when someone asked. A big one. It cost him everything. But at the end, he tried to make it right. He tried to help other people avoid his mistakes. That counts for something. But he laughed at you. In front of everyone. He did. Arthur looked out at the cemetery, at the rolling Oklahoma hills, at the land that had belonged to Warren and now belonged to a dozen different families. And I learned something from that. I learned that the people who laugh at you don't matter. What matters is what you do next. What matters is whether you get up or stay down. And you got up. I got up. Arthur smiled. A small smile, a quiet smile, and I stayed up. That's the only revenge that matters. Let me end this story where it began. In an auction barn on a cold morning with a man who had nothing. Arthur Tidwell is 91 years old now. He still lives on the land his grandfather homesteaded in The house is newer. He built a proper one in 1990 when his daughter got married and needed a place to raise her family. But the land is the same. He still wears Red Wing boots. Not the same pair from 1980, of course. Those wore out eventually, like all things do. But the same brand, the same style. He buys a new pair every 7 or 8 years, when the old ones can't be repaired anymore. And every year, on the 3rd Saturday of November, he drives to the Grady County auction barn, not to buy anything, not to sell anything, just to watch, just to remember. He remembers walking in barefoot, 34 years old, $340 in his pocket, and nothing else. He remembers Warren Caldwell's pointing finger, the crowd's laughter, the cold concrete under his bare feet. He remembers walking home that night, making a promise to himself that he didn't know how to keep, and he remembers keeping it anyway, dollar by dollar, year by year, until the man who laughed had nothing, and the man with no shoes owned his land. Some people call that revenge. Arthur doesn't. He calls it patience. He calls it persistence. He calls it his father's wisdom, passed down through generations. Stay poor if you have to, stay small if you have to, but stay free. And he calls it a lesson for anyone who's ever been laughed at, mocked, told they don't belong, told they can't succeed. The lesson is simple. They're wrong. They're wrong about you. They're wrong about what you can do. They're wrong about where you can go. The only question is whether you believe them or whether you believe in yourself, Arthur Tidwell believed in himself. On bare feet, with nothing but 80 acres and his father's advice, he built something that outlasted empires. And every November, when he sits in that auction barn and remembers, he takes off his boots for just a moment. He puts his bare feet on the cold concrete, and he smiles.